Welcome to Calliope. Several light years from the edge of the Dawn Line shore and slightly further from the Ryoko blink station, the system of Calliope sits at the midpoint of the Long Rim's nadir transit route. Like the rest of the Long Rim, it's a backwater, far removed from the lofty idealism of Union, the ancient splendor of the Caracan trade baronies, or the imperialistic dreams of Harrison Armory. Many people don't even recognize the name, and those that do know it mostly as somewhere you pass through to get somewhere else. But millions of people live there. Millions of people, clinging on for dear life with only a few feet of metal and plastic between them and the vacuum of space. They all have stories, hopes, and dreams, and they're no less important. History of Calliope. Though wild stories about visits by one of the 10 and doomed pre-fall colonial missions do roaring trade in the bars, there's no evidence that Calliope ever saw a human being until about 300 years ago. Once they got here, though, they wasted no time in making one hell of a mess. Let's get down to it, shall we? The Seminal Mistake. Calliope was first discovered by the Cold Star expedition in the years immediately following the Interest War. Funded by Harrison Armory, Cold Star was a stellar mapping project tasked with finding reliable shipping lanes and stopper points between the Ryoko station and the Dawn Line shore. Originally designated C4L-P313/GW2, Calliope's entire history hinges on a reporting error. The exact details are lost to history, but it appears that one of Cold Star's junior astronomers mistakenly gave Calliope the GW2 designation, indicating that 2 Gaia or near-Gaia worlds had been detected in orbit. Calliope's historians often say this set the tone for everything that followed, a careless mistake leading to bad decisions. Not long after Cold Star returned to Union and its data was distributed to the public, talk of the C4L-P313/GW2 system swept the corporate world. It had 2 Gaia or near-Gaia worlds and stood about halfway between the shore and Ryoko. Given the massive colonial push that Harrison Armory was making into the shore, a stopover for travel to and from it could make whoever controlled it rich beyond their wildest dreams. Of course, Cold Star had never actually visited the system, merely mapped it from light years away. But the expedition's data must surely be trustworthy. After all, it had been sponsored by Harrison Armory. What cause could anyone have to doubt? This lack of caution was compounded by the travel time to C4L-P313/GW2. Yes, a prudent investor would have sent an independent expedition to confirm the Cold Star's report. But if the first thing you sent was a survey team, it would still cost a significant portion of the time and money it would take to send a colony ship. If your rivals cut out the middleman, all your scouting expedition would tell you was that somebody beat you to the punch. No, the corporations had to send full expeditions at once. No delay could be tolerated. Colony ships were pushed out from Ryoko in record time. So it was that a decade later, dozens of colony ships, terraforming projects, and construction crews showed up in C4L-P313/GW2, horrified to discover that it was a wasteland with no habitable worlds. Even worse, the system currently sat in the middle of a decades-long blink void, making omnian communication impossible. The few lucky expeditions with enough fuel for a return trip turned around and went home, but the vast majority were left stranded in an unsettled system, light years from help. Entire ships sat laden with terraforming gear and prefab structures, rendered useless by a lack of suitable planets. Construction crews sat on top of materials to build orbital infrastructure for colonies that could never exist. There was little hope of rescue. Faced with the monumental cost of sending out supply convoys and tankers just to bring a bunch of colonists home, most corporations wouldn't bother, and even the more conscientious ones would only send for their own. Union couldn't be relied upon either. They were busy rebuilding after the revolution. Setting aside company loyalties, the remaining expeditions united behind a simple, desperate plan: lie. The only way to get fresh supplies into C4L-P313/GW2 was to convince their sponsors that the project was still viable, but would require significantly more resources than initially estimated. The Blink Void also presented a unique opportunity. If they sent their transmissions now, they'd beat the returning vessels, who were still accelerating and wouldn't reach near light for months. As with many decisions in Calliope, it was made with the best of intentions. It was a bad idea that made things worse. No refuge in Audacity. Upon hearing the first reports from their expeditions, the corporations reacted with a frantic scramble to send more colonists. In an environment rife with espionage, they were aware that their rivals had received similar tidings from their own colonists. This manic rush to send a second expedition stretched many corporations past the limit of their operational budgets. The more observant executives had misgivings about what the colonists were requesting: fuel, pause tank maintenance supplies, spare parts for near-light drives, and in some cases, entire empty colony ships. These things were, to put it bluntly, not traditionally associated with a successful colonial mission, with a strong desire to stay where it was. But pressure from shareholders to see a return on investment outweighed these concerns. Even when the few expeditions that had been able to return home reported that the system was barren, they were ignored. Clearly, this was some kind of ruse. The corporations had received dozens of reports that the system was a paradise. And who were they going to trust? No, the second waves would depart on schedule. Meanwhile, the first wave had not been idle. To survive until rescue came, they'd cannibalized their original hardware to build makeshift habitats. Work crews were already equipped to build orbital infrastructure, and it didn't take too much adaptation to start harvesting the resources the settlements needed. Some optimistic groups even started trying to terraform the planets that would one day be called Asphodel and Emraz. Life was still brutally hard. Rationing on basic supplies was tight. Essential equipment had to be jury-rigged, reverse-engineered, or developed from scratch. Technical failures were rampant, as machinery was stretched far beyond its intended scope and lifespan. By the time the second wave arrived, attrition had claimed almost 15% of the original complement. Unsurprisingly, when the second wave of colonists found a hellscape where they expected paradise to be, many heated words were thrown around. Historians have variously characterized them as accusations, recriminations, and even violent threats. Once the second wave had arrived, there was no hope of keeping C4L-P313/GW2's situation secret any longer. The Blink Void had receded, and real-time communication was possible once again. The second wave colonists immediately contacted their corporate sponsors and informed them of the desperate state the system was in. This decision had unexpected and deeply problematic results that ran contrary to the intentions of those who made it, which is to say, it was a bad idea that made things worse. When the news broke of C4L-P313 not being Gutta 2, the corporations involved in its colonization split into two groups: those who promptly hung up the Omnihook and pretended they'd never heard of such a place, and those who were forced to double down. The former group was mostly comprised of large, wealthy, well-established organizations who saw the entire business as an embarrassing mistake they'd rather just write off and forget. Let the victims' families sue. 100,000 compensation packages would still be cheaper than trying to salvage the project. The latter group, by comparison, were mostly smaller, less stable companies for whom a single failed project could spell bankruptcy. They were fully engaged in C4L-P313, and their only options now were ride or die. The Pyrite Age. Those corporations unwilling to waste further money on C4L-P313 abandoned their stakes and colonial charters, selling them to the remaining parties for a pittance. In order to stave off bankruptcy and spread the financial burden, most of the corporations banded together in a consortium that styled itself the Calliope Project, formally adopting a nickname for the system that had already been in use for a while. Colonists from both waves, in dire straits and at each other's throats, abruptly found themselves under new management. Calliope had no habitable worlds? No matter, it didn't need them. The ingenuity displayed by the first wave while making the best of a bad situation was deeply inspiring, they were told. They'd forged habitats and living spaces without the need for a Gaia world. The system would now pivot from colonization to mineral extraction. It was time for everyone to put aside their differences and work together. At first glance, this idea seemed workable. For all its many shortcomings, Calliope was fantastically rich in mineral resources. With recent advancements in both artificial intelligence and mechanized chassis, mining was safer and more lucrative than ever before. By this time, settlement of the Dawnline shore was speeding up, and Union was announcing a new public works project every week. All of these projects were hungry for raw materials. The markets were there. There really was a sense of renewed hope in those days. The project launched Operation Dawn, sending a third and final wave of ships, this time bearing the goods and equipment the system actually needed. Plans for a major mining station were quickly drawn up, and construction work started almost immediately. One of the project's most ambitious members, Impact Dynamics, switched industries entirely, from ballistics research to agriculture and hydrology, and it worked. Food shortages became a thing of the past as Impact Plaza started churning out fruit and vegetables so fast they had to organize system-wide feast days just to avoid running out of storage space. The Borealis, a giant ice mining vessel, arrived with the third wave and had fresh, pure water running to every habitat within a year of its arrival. The newly built mining platform stoked the fires of industry. In the space of only a few decades, Calliope changed from the punchline of political omnicasts to a byword for high-risk, high-reward investments. Once, there was even blue-sky talk of building a blink gate. Right there in the system, it would have been few by a station. The mere mention of that name can still bring some Calliopeans to bitter tears. The flaw in Calliope's grand project was a matter of location. It had originally been theorized as a good stopover point between Ryoko and the Dawnline shore. But it wasn't serving as that anymore. It was a mining system, equally far from both. GMS wasn't about to trek light years outside Ring 11 for materials they could mine for themselves anywhere else. That left Harrison Armory and the Karakin trade baronies in the Dawnline shore, and for a time, that was good enough. They certainly appreciated having a source of raw materials for their colonies at only half the distance. But they never intended to keep relying on external sources. They needed materials only until they could mine the Dawnline themselves. Calliope sold the rope the armory and the baronies were hanging it with. The fall wasn't a terrifying, sudden collapse. It was a slow boil, a gentle downward slope on export graphs and shareholder quarterlies. Year after year, the system's two most reliable clients were buying less of what it was selling as they began to source their needs in situ. Shrewd executives began quietly selling up their stock and vacating their positions. There was a slow, creeping awareness that something was going wrong. Bosses called for calm, but less of them were seen every day. People with the money to leave were doing so. By the time people knew the full extent of what was going on, it was too late. Too few ships were coming through, and most folks weren't rich enough to buy passage on them. Once again, Calliope was on its own. The Void Age. Gone were the feast days and the dreams of blink gates. The people of Calliope found themselves in the very same jam their predecessors had a couple of generations ago, stuck somewhere nobody wanted to be, with very little hope of getting out, and only what they had on hand to survive. The vast forges of the mining station that was once the system's pride fell silent one by one, as there simply wasn't enough demand to keep mining ships in the sky. Little by little, quality of life began to fall. One day, a nameless miner looked into the maw of its forward cargo bay, into the glow of smelters burning ore nobody would ever buy, and said it looked like Hell's Gate. It's had no other name since. The few executives on Impact Plaza who didn't flee when they'd had the chance looked out at Calliope, and realized that even if they couldn't leave, they could still live like kings. Everyone needed food. They had it, and with the system's population trapped here, they could charge a premium. What else were the plebs going to do? Eat print loaf? The Borealis held out for a long time, longer than anyone expected, munching ice from the belts of gas giants, and melting it down for pure water. She couldn't give it out for free anymore, but the prices were reasonable. Eventually, though, the drive started to pack up, and she had just enough left in her to get into a stable orbit. They built a drum around her, and now the old girl gets to wake up every day to the buzz of casinos and tattoo parlors. Pirates prowled the space lanes, preying on the weak or unprepared. The conditions on Hell's Gate got a bit worse every year, while impact dynamics jacked up the price of food and water on the same schedule. Union doesn't care. Everyone on the icebreaker Borealis just partied like there'd be no tomorrow and hell, who'd want there to be. The Wasteland of Today. Life's been hard since the start of the Void Age, not least because the people of Calliope had to look out across the long rim and see their story repeated again and again. System after system, station after station, unable to help. Ironically, the thing that saved Calliope in recent years is a combination of everything that damned it in the first place. A second colonization push into the Dawnline shore brought a rush of new traffic through the system, including the armory and the baronies, the ones who squeezed this system dry in the first place. IPSEN chose Calliope as a stopover on one of its major transit routes, and they've been the only reliable flow of new money into the system for some time now. There's been a cultural revival, too. Calliope is unique in many ways, and it captured the imagination of the wider universe in a way no other system in the long rim did. Music, art, and writing by Calliopeans has reached far beyond the system, even to Union's core worlds. Folk in the core know about Calliope's struggle, and that gives some of its people hope. Even the Central Committee has taken notice of the system, finally, and while it hasn't deemed it important enough to assign an administrator, there's a permanent representative on the icebreaker now, and a neutral omninode in the system. There's even a single Union Navy vessel on patrol now, and that's made the pirates a little less bold and impact dynamics, a little less eager to fleece the system's poorest. There's also a thin but steady trickle of new talent into the system. The long rim has always been a place where one can disappear if one really needs to. But Calliope is on a major transit route, and it has a reputation as being slightly more comfortable than the rest of the rim, relatively speaking. Still, living in Calliope is no cakewalk. Being poor is expensive, and folks in Calliope don't have much. Most can barely make enough to keep the lights on and the air flowing. Anyone who could afford to leave did, decades or centuries ago. The pirates grow bolder every year, and pickings are often slim enough that some have turned to preying on other Calliopeans. Too often, the fact that the baronies and the armory are both using the system as a stopover point means that one will have some scheme running to stop the other from getting their convoys to the Dawnline shore. A couple of times every decade, the skies of Calliope blaze with weapons fire as battle groups engage outside of Union's jurisdiction. If the system is lucky, local mercenaries get hired, Mechanics get called in, and resupply runs are purchased. If not, the warring giants just take what they need, press-ganging the unfortunate and seizing vital supplies. Everything in Calliope is falling apart, or close to it. These stations were built centuries ago, mostly by companies that no longer exist, using components that are no longer sold. Techs have to spend weeks or months reinventing the proverbial wheel just to print replacement parts. Half the system's computers are reliant on a legacy code-based GMS stopped supporting 12 decades ago. There are no permanent solutions to technical issues out here, just patches on patches on patches. Calliopeans are used to these sorts of problems. That's their day-to-day. It's a fact of life. They're not even particularly surprised when faced with more outlandish things, like the blink voids. That's just how things are. The whole long rim is weird. But buckle up, things are about to get much weirder. It starts with a broken printer. Timeline. Discovery period. 4648 to 4688U. 4648U. The Cold Star expedition discovers a G-class star, designated C4L-P313, while exploring the Long Rim. It is mistakenly given the /GW2 designation, indicating that it has 2 Gaia or near Gaia worlds. 4677U. The Cold Star expedition returns to Union space, and its findings become public knowledge. Due to its apparent habitability, the C4L-P313/GW2 system attracts immediate interest from colonial organizations. 4679U, the first of the colonial missions to C4LP313/GW2, is launched by Maddox and Hayden Inc., followed shortly thereafter by several others. 4687U, the launch of the Petrovsky Foundational Industries expedition to C4L-P313/GW2 is considered to be the last of the first wave of colonists, although this is arbitrary. Colony ships were launching sporadically all the way up to 4703U, when the second wave is generally agreed to have begun. First Wave Era. 4689 to 4712U. 4689U, the first colony ships arrive in C4L-P313/GW2, only to discover that none of its planets are habitable. Faster-than-light communication is unavailable due to blink void activity. Although each expedition's supplies are plentiful, they're not designed for colonizing planets like the ones they've arrived in orbit of, and they're forced to improvise to survive. 4691U, the continued arrival of colonial expeditions causes increasing strain on local resources. Vessels with sufficient supplies for a journey home begin to leave. With shortages mounting and the situation desperate, the leaders of various expeditions agree to deceive their employers in order to convince them to send a rescue mission. 4693U, the last of the colonial vessels returning to Union space departs. The first wave colonists settle in for a difficult 2 decades awaiting rescue. 4695U, a cluster of makeshift orbital habitats is assembled near the twin planets Amphion and Zethus. This station will one day be known as the Three Sisters. The first recorded use of Calliope as a name for the system occurs. 4697U, construction begins on Endymion's Lament in orbit of the system's third planet, Mraz. 4698U, the first terraforming stations are deployed on the system's second planet, later named Asphodel. At the same time, construction begins on a permanent settlement in the planet's northern hemisphere. 4701U, the falsified reports the first wave sent back reach their parent companies. The planning and assembly of a second wave of colonial expeditions starts immediately, in spite of dire reports from the few returning colony vessels. 4703U, the second wave of colonial expeditions begins to depart. 4704U, running short on reactor fuel, the colonists are forced to search the outer system for helium-3. While scouting the sixth planet, a huge gas giant later named Stygia, they discover massive mineral reserves across its 5 major moons. Efforts to extract helium-3 stall, however, as the colonists lack the equipment to deal with Stygia's strong gravity and lethal radiation belts. 4705 U construction work on Endymion's Lament is completed. The station begins agricultural production. 4706 U, with fuel supplies critically low, the desperate colonists abandon Stygia and explore the 7th planet, a small gas giant they later name Zahak. They find a suitable helium-3 reservoir, but lack sufficient time or resources to construct a new station. As a stopgap, Endymion's Lament is towed into orbit over it. The colony ship Persimmon disappears from historical record at around the same time. 4708 U. Fuel supplies in the system stabilize as Endymion's Lament reaches full operational capacity. However, without a support station in orbit, colonial efforts on Umraz stall. 4709 U. Expeditions out to the system's 8th planet, a gas giant later named Kalevala, report the existence of massive ice rings and a complex swarm of mineral-rich moons and asteroids. Meanwhile, on Asphodel, the northern settlement tops 60,000 residents, who begin to call it Furnace City. 4711 U. The blink void shrouding the system finally ends, making access to the Omnian possible again, but the emergency councils continue to impose blackout. 4712 U. The existence of a 9th planet is confirmed, a small, distant ice giant in a highly inclined orbit, theorized to be a captured rogue planet. It is named Chameleon, but an expedition to it is deemed too costly and dangerous to attempt. Second Wave Era, 4713 to 4758 U. 4713 U. The first colony fleet of the second wave arrives in C4L-P313/GW-U2, followed shortly thereafter by a dozen more. Tensions erupt between the new arrivals and the first wave of colonists. Transmissions which detail the state of affairs reach their parent companies. 4715 U. The dire situation in C4L-P313 has become public knowledge. Union calls involved parties to the Omni and demands arrangements be made to provide relief and evacuation for the colonists, but do not enforce this directive effectively. Colonial subsidiaries belonging to IPSNN, SSC, and Harrison Armory vacate their claims in the system, leaving their associated expeditions with no formal support. 4719 U. The remaining companies, unwilling or unable to abandon C4L-P313, enter into negotiations to form a consortium, the Calliope Project. 4724 U. The Calliope Project finally raises enough venture capital to acquire the suspended colonial charters, bringing every existing colonial expedition in Calliope under its umbrella. At this point, C4L-P313, now officially Calliope, is a de jure corporate domain. 4727 U. The Calliope Project formally commences Operation Dawn, one final, massive expedition to Calliope. This time, it will carry the equipment, materials, and personnel the system truly needs. Amongst the ships selected are the CPS Borealis, a massive ice mining vessel. 4739 U. Operation Dawn's fleet reaches Calliope and immediately begins work. Construction on a massive mining station in high orbit around Stygia begins, with work on Impact Plaza, a vast orbital habitat near Asphodel, following swiftly behind. Once the CPS Borealis arrives in orbit of Kalevala, it ends water shortages throughout the system almost overnight. 4742 U. The original plans for making Impact Plaza a megacity are scrapped in favor of heavy agricultural development. 4744 U. The first refinery module on the Stygia mining platform enters operation, with more modules following over the next 5 years. 4749U, both habitation rings on the Stygia mining platform, are now complete and ready for habitation. A vigorous recruitment drive fills the station to 80% of its capacity within the next decade. 4752U, with the construction of the Ferryman cesium mine, mining operations have now been constructed on all 5 of Stygia's major moons. The Pyrite Age. 4759 to 4862U. As a period of relative stability and prosperity, the Pyrite Age has few significant historical events of its own. However, there were many defining historical events elsewhere in the galaxy at this time. 4759U Impact Plaza is officially declared complete. The Pyrite Age begins. 4804U Union's Bureau of Orbital and Non-Terrestrial Management sends its first civilian liaison, Kelly Yoshiyama, to Calliope. This act represents Union's first official presence in the system. 4823U, in the nearby system of Dijal, the prophet Idlir Hizari foretells the end of the world, according to divine revelations granted to him by a phoenix, the one plumed in golden flame. A religion based upon this prophecy quickly spreads throughout the long rim. 4846U, having falsely predicted the date and time of the apocalypse 3 times, Idlir Hizari announces a 4th prophecy, but is murdered by disillusioned followers before he can finish it. The religion he created quickly splinters along sectarian lines. 4857U, on Ross Shamra, Director General John Creighton Harrison. II dies in the Black Throne incident. 4862U, although the end of the Pyrite Age was more a slow process than a single, definitive event, historians agree the release of the last Calliope Project quarterly earnings report marks a suitable cut-off point. The Void Age. 4863 to 5016U. 4894U, decades of constant operation without maintenance have left the CSP Borealis inoperable. It's set in a high orbit over Kalevala and serves as the core of a new space habitat catering to passing travelers. 4956U, the pirate Lord Prem Baggett founds the Knights of the Dark Core as its first Grandmaster Marshal. 4976U, elsewhere in the galaxy, a Doge/HR Liberator team arrives in orbit of Nestor, encountering fierce resistance from the ruling Forefront regime, who are fielding mechs. A 5-year direct intervention begins. 4991U, construction of Union's neutral Omni node finishes, providing safe, free access to the OmniNet across the entire system. A single Union Navy carrier on a rotating 5-year schedule is assigned to defend the facility, with the first being the UNSCV Menders. 4992U, the Demon Winter takes place on Hell's Gate. The Hellhounds are forced off the station. Bayi Zexian replaces Ryan Gleason as station director. 4996U, tens of thousands of refugees begin arriving from Nestor, seeking somewhere they can escape from both the Forefront and Union. 5004U, steadily worsening conditions aboard Impact Plaza cause workers to engage in a general strike. With Impact Dynamics' internal security forces unable to deal with the situation, the directors hire the Hellhounds to restore order. While this does end the labor action, it results in over 10,000 casualties and more than 3,000 fatalities. In response, Endymion's Lament indefinitely suspends fuel sales to Impact Dynamics and its subsidiaries, and Hell's Gate restricts sale of raw materials. 5005U, the previous year's strike-breaking action has so badly damaged faith in Impact Dynamics' board of directors that Roderick Steele, an entrepreneur who recently arrived in the system, is able to seize a controlling interest in the company. 5008U, 3 of Calliope's major pirate factions unite for Operation Firework, a raid on an armory supply convoy and its battle group scale escort. For unknown reasons, the battle group's capital ships punch out mid-battle, leaving the supply convoy, its subline escorts and strike craft complement behind. 5011U, the Amazon-class carrier UNSCV Thames, under the command of Captain Mercedes Ordaz, arrives to relieve the UNSCV Kinabalu. 5013U, Hell's Gate Station Director Bay Zexian goes missing. The Gates militia commander, Jerry Masters, becomes acting station director. 5016U, the present day. It is early in the year. The events of In Golden Flame start now and take place over the following months and years.